Welcome back to part 2 of lecture number 6 on political absolutism. We finished up the first section of this by talking about Louis XIV's rule and some of the disastrous effects of his attempts to have unrivaled authority. It's important to realize, though, that not all European states became absolute monarchies during this period, and not all absolute monarchies were certainly what we would call successful. Where the absolutist model breaks down, for instance, and doesn't translate well, is in the country of England, for instance. And there are several reasons why we will see various monarchs try to impose their ultimate will, but it's not going to work. In other words, there's several countervailing forces that will prevent absolutism, that model of governance, from effectively taking root in England. First and foremost, there is the existence of the Magna Carta. This document that dated all the way back to 1215 brings a monarch under the rule of law rather than them existing outside of it. For example, it was a declaration long since signed that monarchs cannot have absolute power in England, right? That there exists a rule of law that is higher than that, even than the rule of a king. The Magna Carta also guaranteed the right of habeas corpus, that there could be no unlawful imprisonment of citizens without the due process of law. So Louis XIV's shenanigans in France, for instance, where he would just simply, throw people in jail and let them rot and die in jail, that process is not allowed here in England. Now, that won't stop certain kings and leaders from trying to do that in England, but there is some sort of legal protection via the Magna Carta for citizens in England against that type of abuse. Another countervailing force against the imposition of complete absolute rule by one person in England is simply the existence of Parliament. Parliament is the legislative governing body in England, and they share authority with the monarchy. This bicameral legislature includes representatives that are voted on by the people of their local regions. They send in their representatives to Parliament, and Parliament is there to represent their interests. And by the 16th century, Parliament controls the purse, so to speak. In other words, for many monarchs, they have to go through Parliament. They can't go around this body. They have to work with this body in order to get financing for wars, for instance. And next, what we'll see is by the reign of Elizabeth I, she will not try to be an absolutist ruler, but even if she did try, it wasn't going to happen by simple virtue of her gender. The sad reality of gender relations during this time period in world history is that in most societies, women were not considered to be not only the physical equal of men, they were not considered to be the intellectual equals of men either. They were considered to be inferior by most standards. Not that Elizabeth actually believed all of that. As you can see from the quotation that I have here on the slide, she's very clear about the fact that she does not consider herself to be less than men. Though the sex to which I belong, she said, is considered weak, you will nevertheless find me a rock that bends to no wind. Elizabeth's father was Henry VIII. We've talked about him in the context of imposing his will religiously in England. If you'll recall, during the Protestant Reformation, he is the one who will break England away from the Roman Catholic Church and help to set up the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. His daughter, Elizabeth I, when she takes the throne, understands that she's got to sort of prove that she's not going to be bullied or pushed around by her male advisors, and she will implement a number of changes. She will take a strong lead in helping the English establish several settlements in the New World, especially in North America. She will also practice religious toleration to Catholics. This was not something that she necessarily had to do, but she felt compelled to do so. She wanted to minimize division and infighting in England between the Catholics and the Protestants. So she felt like the best course of action was to simply let everyone be. She will continue to support the naval ambitions of England during this time. It was under her rule that English naval forces defeated the Spanish Armada. And then finally, we'll see that she will work very closely with Parliament, this representative body in England. She was willing to recognize their authority so long as they were willing to recognize her authority. So we will see the growth of parliamentary power under her reign. Elizabeth never married as monarch of England because she understood that to marry would mean that all of her power, her independent power, would simply be lost, that everyone would listen to her husband instead of her. So because of this, she never has an heir to the throne. When she dies, therefore, what we will see is a massive transition in the English monarchy. We are going to see some outsiders. Several Scottish kings take over. This is the beginning of the so-called Stuart Dynasty in England. It will be the cousin of Queen Elizabeth, James Stuart, or James VI, who will succeed to the throne after Elizabeth's death. And to put it mildly, the English will be unamused at having these foreigners, these Scottish kings, come to rule over them. Some of the objections are based in simple religious differences. The Scots nobility are purely Roman Catholic, whereas the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, largely held sway in England. And in particular, the Puritans in Parliament are infuriated. The Puritans are even a splinter sect of the Church of England. They're not even part of the Church of England. They have kind of gone off on their own, and they really don't like this new Roman Catholic king. By the way, the feeling was mutual. As King James I comes to the throne, he's not too fond of the English and their system either. The Scots had no parliament of their own. I mean, this is a foreign concept in Scotland to have an elected body of representatives that worked with the king. This was not something that he was interested in. Rather, he wanted to exercise complete and sole authority. James I was definitely interested in the absolutist model of governance. And you can see that in the few times in which he actually will meet with Parliament, something he doesn't like doing. You can see from the quotation that I have here on the slide that this is not a good fit for him. He said, I'm obliged to put up with what I cannot get rid of. He couldn't dissolve Parliament without causing a tremendous amount of controversy and backlash, so he kind of has to hold his nose and deal with them intermittently. As you might imagine, this does not endear him to members of the English public, and Parliament is growing angrier by the day at dealing with this foreign king who will claim that he has a right to rule by divine right. Now, James I died in 1625 and was succeeded by his son, Charles I. And initially, it looked like things were going to go a little bit better under Charles I. He seemed to be a little bit more agreeable, but he is like his father in that he strongly believed in the divine right theory of kingship. And Charles was even more anti-Puritan than his father had been. He also had a French Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria, and these things only continued to anger Puritans in Parliament. To impose his will, Charles I began simply imprisoning his political enemies with no trial. Remember, this is a violation of the Magna Carta. He began running up huge debts and trying to raise taxes to pay for war with France and to finance his luxurious lifestyle. Parliament begins balking at this, saying, nope, we control the purse strings and we're not going to give you any more money for your pet projects. So Charles I decides, well, I'm just going to dissolve Parliament. You guys are not going to meet anytime soon since you won't do my bidding. 10 years of no Parliament meeting only led to increasing anger against Charles I's rule. We see several rebellions cropping up in various areas. Ultimately, what we'll see is that Parliament comes gunning for Charles I. They are getting to a point where he seems to be disrespecting their rights as English citizens. He seems to be wasting vast amounts of money. He just seems like he's become an enemy to the state rather than a defender of the state. Parliament even begins raising their own fighting force to counteract the king's army. Civil war was on the horizon. Ultimately, Parliament's forces prevailed against the king's military forces, and in 1647, Charles was brought into custody of the parliamentarian General Oliver Cromwell, who we'll be speaking about in a moment. King Charles I was put on trial for treason, for betraying the rights of his countrymen, and he was found guilty. He was executed on the 30th of January, 1649, at Whitehall in London. With the death of King Charles I, the monarchy in England was also abolished and a republic was declared. This is a momentous change, to say the least. The republic that is declared will be run by Oliver Cromwell, who will be supported by his so-called New Model Army. Cromwell was a Puritan, although he did believe in religious freedom and toleration. Over time, what we'll see is this Lord Protector, the title that he begins to take. He will begin implementing a form of theocracy, or religious-run government, under the Commonwealth. For instance, one of the main beliefs of Puritans was that if you worked hard, you would get to heaven, and so goofing off, just enjoying yourself to enjoy yourself was deeply frowned upon by Puritans such as Cromwell. He shuttered many inns and theaters under his rule. Most sports were banned, as well as the pastime of gambling. Swearing was now being punished by a fine, and those who kept swearing could be sent to prison. It sounds a little bit like Calvin's Geneva, doesn't it? A kind of a humorless theocracy. Also, Cromwell was perpetually at war with the Irish, for example, to bring them under his control. All this warfare wore people out. Many began to reject the high taxes and this strict censorship and strict control over their behavior. This unpopularity meant that upon Cromwell's death in 1658, his son Richard took control, but he lacked the force and will of his father to hold things together. After 40 years of parliamentary and military conflict, people were ready to return to order and tradition. And so here's where we get to the restoration of the monarchy. They're done with this experimental Commonwealth. They say, let's just return to a monarchy. As a result, Charles II returned to England from the Spanish Netherlands without bloodshed and was reinstalled on the throne. Thus ended the English Civil War and began the era of the Restoration. Charles II, however, was also not popular. He had numerous mistresses, was probably a Roman Catholic, although he tended to keep that quiet. The Restoration also did not settle the fundamental question of power between the king and Parliament, who should have greater power. In fact, Charles II returned even more convinced that absolute monarchy was the way to go. Charles will begin dissolving parliamentary meetings, angering the population once more. Upon his death, Charles's Catholic brother James II succeeded to the throne in 1685. James II was openly Catholic, and you can imagine how unpopular that was, especially with the Puritans in Parliament. He will also dissolve Parliament and began trying to undercut its power over time. And ultimately what we're going to see is, in this instance, James II will be allowed to live, but he's not going to be allowed to stay on the throne. So fortunately, without any bloodshed attached to it, we will have the so-called Glorious Revolution in England in 1688. The Glorious Revolution will see King James II kicked off the throne, and instead his daughter Mary, along with her husband William of Orange, will be invited to come rule England. Now, what's the benefit of replacing one king with now two monarchs? Well, this time the members of Parliament and the gentry, the upper middle class, are going to make sure that their new monarch played by the rules. A new constitution will be developed in England as a result of the Glorious Revolution, and the English Bill of Rights will be drafted. This will be a declaration of the fundamental rights of people living underneath an English monarchy. Freedom of speech, freedom of elections, the right to petition, forbidding cruel and unusual punishment. Some of this should sound familiar because the later U.S. Bill of Rights will be modeled on the English Bill of Rights. Still, there will be questions lingering about the nature of power. John Locke will be a very influential English philosopher who will write extensively about the rights of people living underneath an unjust monarchy. And in particular, in his two treatises of government, his most famous work will assert that people have a right to rebellion against a government that oppresses them rather than protects their rights. He will also argue that human beings start out as a tabula rasa. This means a blank slate, and that as you grow and learn, that your life should reflect that.